If this sacred journey calls to your spirit, subscribe, leave a like and share in the comments. What is God teaching you about true prayer today? Tell me where you're watching from. Let's seek together. Now, in the quiet corners where desperation meets faith, something profound unfolds. She sits by the bedside, where fever burns and breath comes shallow. Her hands fold, not in ritual, but in recognition. That healing prayer carries weight beyond the asking, beyond the hoping, beyond even the receiving. Ellen White understood what most never glimpse. The real power flows, not from the intensity of our pleading, but from the surrender of our will. In the shadows of sick rooms and the dimmed light of dawn vigils, she witnessed prayers that moved heaven and others that echoed back empty. The difference lay not in the eloquence of words or the fervor of emotion, but in something deeper, the quiet alignment of human desire with divine wisdom. She writes in selected messages that many approach God like demanding children, listing their wants with the assumption that faith means getting what we ask for. But true healing prayer begins where this assumption ends. It starts in the recognition that we see through glass darkly, that our understanding of what constitutes healing remains partial, clouded by immediate pain and limited perspective. The real power emerges when the prayer ceases to be the director of outcomes and becomes instead a willing participant in a larger story. This is not passive resignation, but active trust, the kind that dares to say, "Your will be done," even when the valley grows dark and the mountain seems impossible to climb. She observed that the most powerful healing prayers often came from those who had learned to hold their requests with open hands. They pleaded earnestly, yes, but without the desperation that seeks to bind God to human timelines and human definitions of blessing. Their faith rested not on receiving what they wanted, but on trusting the heart of the one who hears. In the light that filters through suffering, something unexpected happens. The prayer changes not just circumstances, but the one who prays. Sometimes bodies mend, sometimes spirits find peace in continuing struggle, and sometimes the healing comes through pathways the prayer never imagined. But always, when prayer flows from surrender rather than demand, the real power touches what matters most, the alignment of finite hearts with infinite love. You must understand. The pathway to powerful prayer winds through valleys most believers never dare to walk. Ellen White saw that the difference between effective and empty intercession lies not in the techniques learned, but in the territory traveled, the hard ground of self-surrender and the narrow pass of genuine submission. She writes in Testimonies for the Church that many stumble because they approach healing prayer like a transaction. They believe earnestness equals volume, that repetition builds pressure, that emotional intensity creates spiritual leverage. But she witnessed the quiet power that moves mountains, and it followed a different route entirely. The journey begins with brutal honesty about our motivations. Why do we seek healing? Is it to escape consequences we've brought upon ourselves? To maintain comfort and convenience? To prove God's favor to watching skeptics? Or do we truly desire restoration that serves His purposes and reflects His glory? The prayers that penetrate heaven start with this examination, this willingness to let our hidden agendas surface and dissolve. Walk further down this path, and you encounter the discipline of waiting without wavering. Not the passive waiting of resignation, but the active waiting of expectant trust. She observed that powerful prayers learn to distinguish between God's delays and God's denials, understanding that His timing operates on scales human urgency cannot comprehend. The terrain grows more challenging. Here you must release your grip on how healing should look, when it should come, through whom it should flow. The prayer warrior learns to desire God's best answer rather than insist on their preferred answer. This requires a level of trust that most find terrifying. The trust that His love operates even when His actions confuse our limited understanding. She noted that those who traveled this complete pathway often found something unexpected. Their prayers began to align naturally with heaven's purposes. They stopped fighting against God's wisdom and started cooperating with it. Their requests became less about changing God's mind and more about changing their own hearts to receive whatever form His blessing would take. When you reach this place, where your will bends gladly toward His will, the real power flows. Not because you've mastered technique or accumulated enough faith points, but because you've removed the barriers that block the current of divine love. The healing that comes may surprise you. It always serves purposes larger than your original request, and it always reflects the character of the one who hears every sincere prayer. Before the throne where every petition finds its hearing, Christ stands as both advocate and example, and in his earthly ministry, Ellen White discovered the true pattern for healing prayer that penetrates beyond symptoms to reach the source of human brokenness. She draws from the desire of ages to reveal how his approach to healing prayer differed radically from human expectations. When he touched the leper, spoke to the paralytic, or called Lazarus from the tomb, his prayers carried no hint of uncertainty, no bargaining with heaven, no manipulation of divine favor. His communion with the Father flowed from perfect unity of purpose. He sought only what the Father was already prepared to give. Watch him. In Gethsemane, where the weight of humanity's healing rested on his shoulders, here was the ultimate healing prayer, not for physical restoration, but for spiritual redemption. If it be possible, let this cup pass from me. The honest acknowledgement of human desire, yet immediately followed by, nevertheless, not my will but yours be done. The surrender that opened heaven's power to flow through the cross toward every broken life. His prayers revealed that true healing begins with the recognition that we stand before a judge who is also our Redeemer. The court of heaven operates not on the basis of our arguments, but on the foundation of his intercession. When we pray for healing, we don't petition a distant deity who needs convincing. We approach a Father whose heart is already inclined toward our restoration, whose Son has already paid the price for our wholeness. The evidence Ellen White presents from his ministry shows that healing prayer finds its power, not in our faith, but in his faithfulness. The centurion's servant was healed through the master's recognition of divine authority. The woman with the issue of blood found restoration through her touch of his garment, but it was his power, not her desperation, that made her whole. Even when others brought the sick to him, the healing flowed from his compassion, not from their intensity of request. This changes everything about how we approach the throne of grace. Instead of coming as defendants pleading our case, we come as children whose older brother has already secured our acceptance. Instead of trying to generate enough faith to move heaven, we rest in the faith he has already demonstrated on our behalf. When we understand that Christ himself carries our healing prayers before the Father, that our stammering petitions are presented through his perfect intercession, the desperate striving ceases. The real power operates through his merit, his love, his perfect understanding of what we truly need for genuine restoration. Through seasons of testing and harvest of character, she traced the developing pattern of those who learn to pray with genuine power, discovering that healing prayer matures like fruit on a tree, requiring patience, pruning, and the deep roots that only come through sustained spiritual cultivation. Ellen White chronicles in her testimonies how character formation creates the soil where effective prayer grows. She observed that those whose prayers moved heaven had walked through specific seasons of spiritual development, times when their natural inclinations towards self-serving requests were gradually transformed into genuine concern for God's glory and others' welfare. The spring season brings the first stirrings of authentic prayer life. Here, believers begin to recognize the difference between praying about their problems and praying from genuine relationship with God. The early prayers for healing often carry traces of bargaining, promises of better behavior in exchange for divine intervention. Yet even these immature prayers receive tender attention from a Father who sees the sincere heart beneath the flawed understanding. Summer's heat brings the season of testing, where shallow prayer withers while deep-rooted intercession flourishes. She witnessed how suffering and delay exposed the true motivations behind healing requests. Some grew bitter when their prayers weren't answered according to their timeline. Others discovered that wrestling with God in honest struggle actually strengthened their spiritual muscles and deepened their capacity for genuine faith. The harvest season reveals the fruit of matured prayer life. Those who had endured the full cycle learned to approach healing prayer with both boldness and humility. Bold, because they understood their access through Christ's righteousness. Humble, because they had learned their own limitations and God's infinite wisdom. Their prayers for healing began to carry the fragrance of surrender and the power of purified motives. She documented how these seasoned prayers developed what she called sanctified judgment, the ability to discern when to persist in prayer and when to accept God's alternative answer. They had learned through experience that sometimes the greatest healing comes through continued struggle that builds character, and sometimes the most merciful answer is not yet, rather than yes immediately. The winter season teaches the deepest lessons. Here, in the apparent dormancy when prayers seem to echo unanswered, the roots grow deepest. Those who learned to pray effectively for healing discovered that these seasons of hiddenness were actually times of preparation, when their spiritual foundations strengthened to handle the greater responsibilities that powerful prayer always brings. Through each season, one principle remained constant: character and prayer, life developed together. Those whose healing prayers carried real power had allowed God to heal their own hearts first, addressing pride, selfishness, and the subtle attempts to use prayer as a means of controlling divine action rather than cooperating with divine love. In the flowing streams of practical service, she discovered where healing prayer finds its truest expression, not in the isolation of private petition, but in the outward current of compassion that carries divine power into suffering communities and broken lives. Ellen White writes in Gospel Workers about a profound observation: those whose prayers for healing carried the greatest power were invariably those whose lives poured out in service to others. The connection was not coincidental. As believers learned to become channels of God's healing love through practical ministry, their own prayer life transformed from self-focused requesting to other-focused intercession. She witnessed this pattern repeatedly in the early workers who established institutions of healing and education. Their days began with prayer for the sick, the struggling, the spiritually hungry, and their prayers carried unusual power because they were willing to become part of the answer. When they asked God to heal, they offered their own hands to provide medical care. When they prayed for the spiritually wounded, they gave their own time to counsel and encourage. The cleansing water of selfless service purified their motives and clarified their understanding of divine healing. They stopped praying for miracles that would advance their reputation and began interceding for restoration that would serve others' deepest needs. Their healing prayers became instruments of love rather than demonstrations of spiritual prowess. She documented how these servant prayers developed an intuitive understanding of when to pray for immediate physical healing and when to pray for grace to endure continued suffering with purpose. Because they worked daily among the sick and struggling, they saw firsthand how God's healing sometimes came through restored health and sometimes through sanctified suffering that touched other lives with hope. Their prayer gatherings in hospitals, schools, and mission stations carried a different quality than typical church prayer meetings. Here, abstract theological concepts dissolved into concrete requests for specific individuals with particular needs. Here, healing prayer became a community effort where multiple believers united their faith for the restoration of those they served personally. The flowing water of their service created channels where divine power could flow naturally. They learned that healing prayer gains extraordinary power when it flows through lives dedicated to practical ministry. Their intercession carried authority because their compassion was demonstrated, their faith was active, and their motives were purified through daily acts of self-sacrificing love. She observed that these workers rarely needed to pray long or loudly for healing. Their brief, quiet petitions carried the weight of lives poured out in service. Heaven responded readily to prayers offered by hands already busy with healing work, hearts already broken for others' pain, and spirits already surrendered to whatever form God's restoration might take. When the last shadow falls and all human strategies fail, the real power of healing prayer stands revealed, not as a technique mastered or a formula perfected, but as the natural overflow of a life surrendered so completely to divine love that heaven and earth collaborate in the restoration of broken things. She returns us to the beginning, where desperate hearts first kneel beside sickbeds and whisper prayers that seem to echo back empty. But now we understand what she learned through decades of witnessing both miraculous healings and sanctified suffering. The power was never in our prayer, but in our willingness to become so transparent to divine love that God's healing nature could flow through us unhindered. The real power operates when we cease trying to pray healing into existence and instead allow healing to pray through us. This transformation happens gradually, through the seasons of character development, through the purification of motives, through the surrender of our will to divine wisdom. It culminates when our prayers become less about changing God's mind and more about aligning our hearts with His purposes. Ellen White shows us through the example of Christ, through the testimony of faithful workers, through the hard-won wisdom of those who learn to pray with genuine power, that healing prayer finds its greatest effectiveness when it flows from the deepest surrender. Not the surrender of defeat, but the surrender of trust, the recognition that our Heavenly Father's love operates perfectly even when His methods mystify our understanding. The light that streams through this surrender illuminates a profound truth. We were never meant to be the source of healing power, but rather the vessels through which divine love reaches suffering humanity. When our prayers emerge from lives poured out in service, when our requests flow from hearts broken for others' pain, when our faith rests in God's character rather than our spiritual performance, then the real power moves. This is the healing prayer that transforms not just bodies, but communities, not just circumstances, but characters, not just moments, but eternities. It is prayer that dares to trust divine love completely, prayer that serves others sacrificially, prayer that surrenders absolutely to the one whose healing touch reaches deeper than any human need and whose restoration extends beyond any earthly hope. In the gentle light of such prayer, we discover that we have been healed even as we prayed for others, restored even in our continued weakness, made whole through our willingness to be broken bread in the hands of infinite love.